Good afternoon. This is Kim Clater, Compliance Director with NTA Incorporated. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing developing a drug-free workplace. We're going to review key components. Then we're also going to talk about best practices, procedures, and guidelines. So let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll look first at the training outline. We'll be reviewing this afternoon first the overview of a drug-free workplace policy and a program, and it's going to go through the different components of what an actual non-DOT drug-free workplace program consists of. So we'll get into that first. Then we'll talk about employer responsibilities when you're developing a non-DOT drug-free workplace program. Then we're going to get into identifying performance problems, handling potential crisis situations, recognizing problems. In terms of a non-DOT program, what are your intervention and referral options? What do you want to think about? Protecting confidentiality. Continued supervision once an employee comes back, if that's something that your company is going to elect in terms of developing your policy. Things you would want to keep in mind in terms of enabling, and then finally wrapping up do's and don'ts to keep in mind for employers and supervisors in a non-DOT work environment. And I do want to point out, when we use the term non-DOT drug testing program and drug-free workplace, that is interchangeable. I don't know, who we have in attendance this afternoon, but if we have anyone that actually has a federally regulated, a DOT testing program, that typically is not technically considered a drug-free workplace program. Drug-free workplace tends to fall under the umbrella. That tends to encompass your non-DOT workforce, those that are not federally regulated. So when you get into your different state laws, those are typically, they fall under the umbrella of usually DOL, Department of Labor, and they usually fall under the drug-free workplace statutes and guidelines within each state. So we'll talk about that momentarily so you have a good understanding of, where you would want to look when you're looking for each state, what those guidelines are. And most of our attendees typically they fall within Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Those states are they're very similar with their drug-free workplace guidelines. Most of the surrounding states really are quite, similar with some differences, but we'll talk about that. So let's go ahead and move forward. So the objectives of the training, again, at the end of this, we want you to understand the basic components of a standard drug-free workplace program. Again, from state to state, there could be, some small differences. And, if any of you are looking to implement, if anyone is looking to implement a full drug-free workplace program, you just contact us. We can help you with that. We'll, of course, explore your state, make sure that your program does comply with your state drug-free workplace guidelines. Then you should understand your employer responsibilities and best practices within that drug-free workplace program. You have some standard responsibilities, you have some standard best practices, procedures, and guidelines that you really have to operate within. So we definitely want to make sure that we cover those and we touch on those. So you want to, in terms of those best practices, we'll touch a little bit on how to identify and investigate those crisis situations as they arise, recognize workplace problems that may be related to alcohol and other drugs, intervene in problem situations, referring employees that have problems with alcohol and other drugs, particularly if you decide as a company that you are going to retain those employees, developing an AP program, that kind of thing, which you do not have to do. You can simply have a policy of termination, how to protect employee confidentiality regardless, how to continue to supervise those employees who have been referred for assistance, then they return, and how to avoid enabling and other supervisory traps. And we will get into that, things that are very common that you may or may not be familiar with. So let's go ahead and let's talk first about the overview of a basic drug-free workplace program. There are two things that you want to accomplish, two major things that you're going to want to accomplish when you implement a non-DOT drug-free workplace program when you're looking at developing that. Number one, you want to send a clear message that use of alcohol and drugs in the workplace is prohibited. That's the first thing you're looking at. And sometimes clients have other reasons for implementing or developing a non-DOT program. It could be because you have a client yourself that is requiring that. It could be they are looking to, they may perhaps obtain the workers' comp insurance discount premiums. Some states offer that. I know in Virginia, you can get up to a 5% discount of your workers' comp premiums if you can meet the drug-free workplace criteria of your underwriter. And in different states, for instance, North Carolina, there are certain discounts if you can meet certain criteria, within different insurance entities. So again, people have different objectives, but whatever that initial objective could be, you want to send a clear message that alcohol and drugs in the workplace is prohibited. And that could simply be just for safety reasons and risk management. You want to encourage employees that have problems with alcohol and drugs to voluntarily seek help. And what this means, the policy and the testing is designed to be a deterrent and to encourage that employee, or perhaps to give them an incentive before it reaches a crisis point of either intervention or a positive test. Look, I need help. Let me come forward. Let me, perhaps seek help, get this problem addressed before there is a crisis situation of either termination or something else that can occur as a result of the substance abuse. So that's really what a drug-free workplace program would accomplish, those two major things. A drug-free workplace program exists to, one, protect the health and safety of all employees, customers, and the public. This second one is very important. What I find often, particularly if I'm teaching reasonable suspicion, supervisory training, which is a pretty detailed, intense class, safeguarding employer assets from theft and destruction. Substance abusers and most often the general public is not aware that substance abuse goes hand in hand with criminal activity. And it's not necessarily because the substance abuser started out perhaps as a criminal or has an innate criminal personality, but you're going to substance abusers are going to run through their financial resources to support their habit. And once they've run through their financial resources, they're going to start stealing from their employers. And unfortunately, we see that over and over. So a drug-free workplace program does exist to safeguard the employer assets from theft and destruction. So it can be from stealing from the company to support a drug habit, up to if they're impaired under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and they operate equipment, to actually having accidents, damaging equipment. Then, obviously with the accidents, they can incur liability, lawsuits, that kind of thing. So you want to keep that in mind, that it, really offers a safeguard and a safety net in terms of protecting those employer assets as well. You want to it helps maintain product quality, company integrity, and reputation. I can tell you in the 29 years in this industry, I have come to pretty much know, a lot of times the companies that have a quality drug-free workplace program and a commitment to the best of their ability to have a drug-free workplace, they are going to tend to have, the best workers' comp rates. They're going to attract the best employees. They're going to have healthier workplaces, better morale all the way around than those that do not. Because in today's environment, with the federally regulated and with more and more non-federally regulated companies, going the route of the non-DOT drug-free workplace programs, people that are substance abusers are finding less and less opportunity to get a good quality job. So, a drug-free workplace program can really help you maintain a quality, company integrity, and reputation. And of course, it does help you comply with federal, state drug-free workplace laws that the employer may be subject to. So the basic components would be, for a successful program, this is what you're going to want to look at. You're going to want to have, number one, a written policy distributed to all employees. Now, the policy is going to have to look at, it's going to explain the scope of testing, what group of employees this would apply to, discipline, consequences. It's going to look at testing methodologies. It's going to talk about what type of testing they're going to want to do. We're going to get into each one of these. Then you're going to look at drug and alcohol testing, pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable calls, return to work, follow-up testing. Now, often, if you're going to implement a drug-free workplace program, the actual testing itself, it depends on what your objectives are. If your workers' comp company, if they are looking to give you a discount, they may mandate what type of testing you have to do. So I want to make that clear. So you would have to find that out. But if, for instance, I drew one up recently for a client that just said, we just want to do post-accident reasonable calls. That's, sometimes what you can do. So you would want to decide, do we want to do pre-employment, some form of random, post-accident, reasonable calls, return to work, and follow-up testing. The return to work would be typically after there's been an accident, injury, or a positive drug test. They've gone through treatment, they're coming back. And then the follow-up testing would be typically after substance abuse treatment. So that's the reasons for those testing. Supervisor training, that typically falls under reasonable suspicion. That would be your policy training as well. So the reasonable suspicion supervisory training is typically usually about a 1.5 to 2 hour training. It goes through the legalities of reasonable suspicion, how they observe, how they document, how they talk to the employee, basic signs and symptoms of substance abuse. And then the policy training is where you actually want to take time with your supervisors to sit down, go through what your actual policy stipulates and mandates. You want to make sure that your supervisors understand what the company policies are. Often they do not know. So they definitely, you want to make sure they definitely know that. Employee training, the employees need to understand basic substance abuse awareness, not only in others, but possibly in themselves. Just what are some signs of perhaps, I'm a little bit on the edge here. Maybe I need help. Maybe they're close to one of their coworkers and they realize a coworker needs help. They could then be in a position to perhaps encourage that coworker to come forward and seek help. And then the employees need to have some sort of policy training so they can understand what is it that our policy requires. What is it that the policy says? What are we subject to? So these are your basic components of a non-DOT testing program. So to implement a successful program, you want to have that written policy, the actual testing. You've got to determine, which ones of these do you want to do: supervisor training, employee training. So let's look at the policy a little more a little more closely. So what is the purpose of the policy and the program? So again, you would decide what is our objective? Are we trying to create a safer workplace? What is the scope of this? Who is covered by the policy? Are we going to cover all employees? And that would mean all employees from perhaps the CEO down through janitorial staff. Are we going to cover just a segment of employees? Who is covered by this policy? And often you want to keep in mind, we see companies often that they have DOT-regulated employees. They will also, they will have their separate DOT program over here, on the one hand, because you have to do that. You can't mix the two. They've got to have the DOT program, but they will take their non-DOT drug-free workplace program, and they will decide, perhaps because of maybe client requirements, that it has a 13-panel test, perhaps, or because it's a more aggressive testing program than DOT. They may say, we want everyone covered. So that DOT employee may perhaps be in two programs, if that makes sense. So you have to make a decision, who is going to be covered by this? What class of employee? The entire company, or will it be a certain class, and for what reason? What is the purpose of that? Have to link those two together. What are the reasons for testing? And again, as I said earlier, you want to decide, are we going to do pre-employment, random, if we're going to do random, at what rate, what ratio? You can go as low as a 10% annual rate a year, 20%, 50%. You can select a number. And again, if you're trying to get some sort of insurance discount, you would want to find out if there is a requirement, a mandate that they have for that. If you're trying to create a program to satisfy some sort of client or union contract, you would want to find out what that mandate is. So again, those are things that you would want to look at. And if you are simply doing this just for risk management, for safety purposes, because this is a goal, an internal company objective, then we can help you determine, okay, what would be a reasonable random rate for you based on the number of employees and the type of work that they do. So typically most companies do pre-employment, some form of random. They will definitely do post-accident, and you do have to think about the OSHA post-accident requirement and kind of their guidance that popped up a few years ago. They want you to do your post-accident testing built around situations that are, fairly serious enough that substance abuse could potentially have contributed to that. So again, you have to be careful with that, and we can provide you guidance, more guidance with that. So it used to be that companies, in their post-accident clause, they would say, well, we just want a post-accident test for, any injury. It doesn't matter how minor, any accident, no matter how minor. And, OSHA does frown upon that. So you want to be a little more discriminating with that, and we can help you with that. Then you get into reasonable suspicion. Most companies do that. You definitely do not want to implement reasonable suspicion unless you are prepared to have your supervisors trained in reasonable suspicion supervisory training. You're going to have a lot of problems legally if you try to do reasonable cause testing, if those supervisors have not been trained in the proper legalities of reasonable suspicion, how you can legally observe, document, and basic signs and symptoms. So you definitely would want to do that. Then you want to decide what behavior is prohibited. Are you going to, is there a certain number of hours before they come on site that they are prohibited from consuming alcohol? If you have on-call employees, are you going to ask them to tell you if they've been consuming alcohol? Those kinds of things. Are employees required to notify supervisors of drug-related convictions? Does the policy include searches? What substances does the program test for? And this is really important. We typically work with clients in depth with this. And again, this is going to go back to the original question, what is the purpose of the policy? Are you simply trying to meet some sort of objective or mandate of a client, or some other entity that is making you drug test? If that's the case, we have to find out what are the drugs they are requiring that you test for. And we see often, for instance, let's say, for instance, Department of Mine, Minerals, and Energy, or some of the big power companies, if you're contracting with them, they will require 11 or 13 panel drug tests. So we need to know, what that test panel is, what the cutoffs are. But if you are simply implementing this for your own, again, internal safety risk management reasons or for insurance reasons, it's usually just a standard 5 to 7 panel test that you're going to want to look for, which would be just your standard drugs of abuse of marijuana, cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine, your opiates, synthetic opiates usually, and then, PCP is what you're going to want to look at, and then probably alcohol as well. But again, this is what we would help you. It's a series of questions and things that we would help you explore and look at. Very important. What are the consequences for violating the policy? You are going to have to really have good conversations within your company about, what will be our company position if we have a verified positive drug screen. And what I mean by that, if you are not used to drug testing, if you've had a DOT program, or perhaps you have a non-DOT now and you're just looking at maybe expanding it, if you're used to the medical review officer process, you know that verified positive drug screens from the laboratory are going to go to the medical review officer first. So your employee will have that opportunity to provide a valid prescription before your company is notified. So they're given an opportunity to provide a legitimate explanation. So by the time that gets to your company representative, whoever you have assigned, we know that they don't have a valid prescription for that, okay? So at that point, you have to decide what are the consequences for violating the policy, for having a verified positive drug test or a verified positive alcohol test, or perhaps you found, if you have a search policy, maybe you found drugs, within their locker or, in the workplace, what is the consequence? So you have to think that through. Will you terminate? Do you have an EAP program? Are you going to have that established? How many times will you let them seek treatment? Will they be compensated? Do you have health insurance that has substance abuse treatment benefits? You have to stipulate who pays for this. Are there return to work agreements? We need to figure out if they are going to be allowed to come back. That has to be listed in the policy. Do you have a return to work test? Who pays for that? Who pays for the follow-up testing? And again, the type of assistance available, if they need help and you're willing to go that far. And then you explain within the policy, which we have typical verbiage, how the confidentiality is protected, who is responsible for enforcing it. This is typically referred to as the designated employer representative. So that is listed. We would ask you who that is, and that is built within your policy. How is the policy communicated to employees? You must give each employee, if you're going to have a drug-free workplace program, you must give each employee a copy of the policy and obtain a signed and dated receipt of that policy. Because if you do not do that, you are not going to be able to enforce your policy and implement any type of disciplinary procedures with that. So you can give that to them, give each one a copy electronically, physically, but you've got to have that signed and dated receipt form. And you can do this. You can have training sessions. It's up to you how detailed you want to be with that. Types of drug and alcohol testing available. You have your standard urine lab test. It's a 5 to 11 panel. That's typically the most popular. It can be collected, it's usually collected off-site at collection sites. You have oral fluid lab testing. That can be easily done in-house. That's saliva testing. Hair testing, it's typically a 4 to 18 panel, can pick up drug use for 90 days. This does tend to be the most expensive option, and keep in mind it does pick up drug use for 90 days. So there are things you want to discuss about that, whereas the urine and oral fluid, you're looking at, usually about a 2 to 4 day window. With marijuana, it can be a little bit longer. Rapid testing, urine and saliva only. You can go with 1 to 13 panel. Your negative results, you can do these in-house. You get your results immediately. Non-negatives, with most of the state drug-free workplace laws, they have to be confirmed at a laboratory with MRO review. So you would want to keep that in mind. Alcohol testing, you want to do breath or saliva. Blood testing is not typically available for workplace testing. So these are things that you would want to explore in developing your program. Training, supervisory training, you have to equip supervisors with training on recognizing impairment, how to handle reasonable suspicion situations. Employee training, ensure employees understand the company's substance abuse policy and issues of substance abuse. So the supervisory training and the role of supervisors is super important in terms of your whole drug-free workplace. And this next segment, that as I move into wrapping up this particular presentation, you'll understand really that equipping the supervisors is going to be key and vital to the success of your program, not just the testing, but just their understanding of really the whole thrust of a drug-free workplace and understanding substance abuse. So now, employer responsibilities and best practices. We're going to take a look at your responsibilities in terms of protecting the company and the employee. These are just general best practices, tips and guidelines for supervisors and employer do's and don'ts. These certainly isn't all-encompassing. These are just general guidelines. So let's take a look. It is your responsibility as an employer to maintain a safe, secure, and productive environment for employees, to evaluate and discuss performance with employees, to treat all employees fairly. You do want to make sure that when you're drawing up your policy that you set this policy in a manner that you feel comfortable that if you decide we're going to terminate for verified positives, this has to apply to everyone. You can't pick and choose who you terminate. So everybody, it has to be fair and equal. Act in a manner that does not demean or label people. It is not your responsibility as a supervisor to diagnose drug and alcohol problems. It is not your responsibility to have all the answers, to provide counseling or therapy, or to be a police officer. Legally sensitive areas to keep in mind. You have to safeguard their confidentiality. You have to ensure your policy is clearly communicated. You have to establish procedures to thoroughly investigate alleged violations of the policy. You have to provide due process and ample opportunity for response to the allegations. You have to ensure you have a quality testing program in place with confirmation of positive tests with medical review. You have to conform to union contracts if applicable. Identifying performance problems and handling potential crisis situations. This you have to keep in mind if you do develop a non-DOT drug-free workplace program. This will raise its head at some point. So you have to learn how and equip your supervisors, particularly with distinguishing between a crisis situation and a performance problem. Crisis situations are less common than performance problems. They can consist of dangerous behavior, threatening behavior, obvious impairment, possession of alcohol and other drugs, and illegal activity. Questions to consider when investigating potential drug or alcohol crisis situation. What exactly do you see? Have the supervisors observing the adverse performance, behavior, or appearance received proper training? Does there appear to be illegal activity, policy violations, or unusual behavior taking place? Is a group of people involved or a single employee? Sometimes we have clients that have departments or crews that work together, and it is not uncommon for entire crews or departments to be involved. So again, this goes back to your supervisor training and their awareness and just understanding the scope of how in-depth this can be. Are reliable witnesses available? Is any physical danger involved in taking action or not taking action? Is the situation serious enough to require calling security or law enforcement? Is there a specific policy that applies to the situation? And again, this is where your supervisors, HR, or your designated employer representatives, that they really understand. They've had training in your substance abuse policy, or maybe even your general employee handbook that you can apply to the situation. Does it require expert consultation from HR, your EAP, if applicable, or security? Is it a situation that calls for reasonable suspicion testing? Have you documented what you see and what you have done in response? Recommended actions to take when confronted with a possible drug or alcohol situation. And again, these are all best practices, and these are things that you're going to want to keep in mind. These are all part of this developing a non-DOT program. Ask the employee to come to a private area with another supervisor and or security personnel. Inquire about the behavior, rumor, or report. Inform the employee of your concerns. Get his or her explanation of what is going on. If you feel there is a problem, notify your superior. If there is evidence or suspicion of recent use based upon the employee's response in your drug-free workplace policy, the supervisor should, 1, refer the employee to the EAP if applicable. 2, place the employee on suspension until a formal investigation takes place. 3, arrange for the employee to be escorted home. 4, escort the employee to a collection. This would be a collection site for the drug test if applicable. So, and again, in essence, recognizing problems. This is just, again, these are best practices and procedures. Addiction. This is the irresistible compulsion to use alcohol or drugs despite adverse consequences. It is characterized by repeated failures to control use, increased tolerance, and increased disruption in the family or workplace. That's the definition of addiction. So if you're going to develop a non-DOT program and have a drug-free workplace, again, you've got to have an understanding of this. Ongoing performance problems that do not respond to normal supervisory actions may be signs of addiction. Could be other personal problems, and it may require more intervention. Examples of common performance problems that may be indicators of underlying addiction include poor attendance, tardiness, unexplained absences, long lunches, coworkers, customer complaints, mistakes, missed deadlines, intervention referral. And you want to think about this when you're developing your substance abuse policy. These are things that you would want to think, okay, are we going to, when we're thinking about intervention and referral, are we going to have an EAP program? Are we going to terminate? Are we going to just simply suspend an employee? They go home, they have to seek help on their own. So you want to think about this, and how far you're going to go. So steps to take when you have identified a performance problem. Document the performance problem. Get yourself ready, set the stage. Use constructive confrontation with good documentation. Refer for assistance. follow up on progress toward meeting performance goals. Now, this is a very concise overview of a very complex process. And again, it's going to depend on how your individual policy is written. If you have a policy of termination, if that's what you've decided to do, you're basically you're just meeting the first part of this. You're documenting a problem. You're discussing, okay, we have a problem. You're documenting. You're going to practice a constructive confrontation, determine what's going on with the employee, and probably request a test at that point, and depending on the results of that test, then you're moving forward. So it's a whole host of things involved right here in this. And again, we would help you with this. So constructive confrontation, what that typically is going to involve is telling the employee you're concerned about their performance, state the problem, refer to documentation of specific events, avoid overgeneralizations, ask for explanation. Avoid getting involved in discussions of personal problems. Try to get the employee to acknowledge what you see as the problem, state what must be done to correct the problem, set a time frame for performance improvement, and specify consequences if problem continues. Protecting confidentiality. And again, we're still in this best practices and procedures of your drug-free non-DOT program. For employer action to be effective, an employee needs to know that problems will not be made public, conversations with an EAP professional or other referral agent are private and will be protected. All information related to performance will be maintained in their personnel file. Information about referral to treatment, however, will be kept separately. Information about treatment for addiction or mental illness is not a matter of public record, cannot be shared without a signed release from the employee. You need to understand that if, as the employer, you decide in developing your program that you want to go that route. So you need to understand these things. If an employee chooses to tell coworkers about their private concerns, that is their decision. When an employee tells their supervisor something in confidence, supervisors are obligated to protect that disclosure. So you want to keep that in mind. If EAP services are available, employees are also assured that. And again, this is what you must do. EAP records are separate from personnel records. They can be accessed only with a signed release from the employee. EAP professionals are bound by a code of ethics to protect the confidentiality of the employee and family members that they serve. There are clear limits on when and what information an EAP professional can share and with whom. So if, as the employer, you decide in developing your program, we're going to establish that employee assistance program, and we're going to put that in place as part of our benefits package. And so if we have verified positives, they can seek that treatment that they need, then you have to understand these guidelines. So that's part of it. But you can, within a non-DOT program, you can also have a policy of saying when we get those verified positives, we are simply going to terminate. You can do that. Or you can suspend. You have different options. And again, if you decide to go that route, let us know, or we can review what you currently have in place. There are some limits on confidentiality that may require, and you've got to understand this, disclosure of child abuse, elder abuse, serious threats of homicide or suicide as dictated by state law. Reporting participation in an EAP to the referring supervisor. Reporting the results of assessment and evaluation following a positive drug test. Verifying medical information to authorize release time. In other words, they may have to verify certain medical information so they know when to authorize return to work time, or to satisfy fitness for duty concerns as specified in the company policy. Revealing medical information to the insurance company in order to qualify for coverage under a benefits plan. continued supervision. After the constructive confrontation and referral, the employee will need continuing feedback about behavior and performance. Now, this is, again, if you go the route of working with the employee versus termination, continuing feedback about behavior performance, encouragement to follow through with continuing care and support groups, accurate performance appraisals and fair treatment, time to adjust to doing things differently, respect for his or her privacy, open lines of communication, and it should be really swift corrective action if old behaviors reappear. Now, we do see a common phenomenon of enabling amongst supervisors, and this tends to be sometimes supervisors, particularly if they've had a long-time relationship with employees, they may fall into this trap, and sometimes they do it intentionally and unintentionally in terms of substance abuse. Enabling is an action that you take that protects the employee from the consequences of their actions and actually helps the employee to not deal with the problem. And examples would be covering up, rationalizing, withdrawing, avoiding, blaming, controlling, threatening. So they would want to be very careful about that. So, do's for employers with your drug-free workplace development. Do emphasize you're only concerned with work performance or conduct. Do have documentation or performance in front of you when you talk with an employee. Do remember that many problems get worse without assistance. Do emphasize that conversations with an EAP, if applicable, are confidential. Do explain that an EAP, if applicable, is voluntary. It exists to help the employee. Do call the EAP, if applicable, to discuss how to make a referral. Don't try to diagnose a problem. Don't moralize. Limit comments to job performance and conduct issues only. Don't discuss alcohol, drug use. Don't be misled by sympathy-evoking tactics. Don't cover up. If you protect people, it enables them to stay the same, and don't make threats that you do not intend to carry out. So finally, wrapping up, to have a roadmap to a safer, drug-free workplace, identify, investigate crisis situations, recognize workplace problems that may be related to alcohol and other drugs, intervene in problem situations, refer employees that have problems with alcohol or drugs if that's in your policy, protect confidentiality, supervise employees that have been referred to assistance. You want to continue to do that, avoid enabling, and common supervisor traps. And so, again, you want to have that written policy, decide on your testing, what types of testing do we want to do, pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable cause, return to work follow-up, good supervisor training, employee education, and again, we can help evaluate your current testing program and objectives, or we can help you decide how to develop one if you would need to do that. Just feel free to contact us. You can ask to speak to a customer service representative. You can visit us at ntatesting.com. You can contact me. My name is Kim Clater, Compliance Director with NTA, and my extension is 351 or K Clater, ntatesting.com. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have found this helpful, and feel free to contact us. We'd be glad to help you. Have a great afternoon.